Good evening. I understand this is the last session. I understand in this heat it's very difficult to concentrate. So I won't take a lot of your time, but for the title, I must say that it's a little more than that's indicated. I kind of say Kudumbashree in the title, but it's actually a little more than that. The reference is really to very different kinds of governmental interventions in welfare that have been poured into this particular site that I'm going to talk about. Now this is actually from research that was done in a fishing hamlet, a small fisher village in the coast of the Trivandrum district, between 2013 and 2015, and then we kept following up what was happening there. There was another survey conducted around 2017. We have been in touch till Okchi and after. Now I want to kind of contextualize this because we're talking about a rural community. Now the debate on democracy and rural transformation in India has been a very large one. And you know that in the post-millennium period, this debate has been led by people like Patron and others who look at the politics of the countryside, shaping in the context of increasing neoliberalization. So, Patron, for example, and many scholars who follow his lead seem to imply that dispossessed communities in cities, urban areas, are more resilient in some way. The kind of petty entrepreneurship that they undertake in city slums seems to provide them with a more stable kind of livelihood, income, etc. While the rural communities are taken to be, fighting for survival. In fact, they have, if you look at it, rural incomes are not great anymore. In the post-millennium period, definitely rural incomes are not great. But you see rural people fighting for their resources in movements and so on. In cities, etc., obviously they seem to be more secure, in the sense that they seem to have a little more of economic opportunity and possibility, even if not security in the proper sense, because after all, labor in the city is also very precarious. But what you see is that they do not have, they kind of are not really able to form collectives to fight back. Despite having a little better, in terms of opportunities. In the rural countryside, opportunities are failing, incomes are failing, livelihoods are at a serious threat. Yet you find more resilience. Now this has been a question that has come up in the discussion on rural livelihoods in the post-millennial period. Now perhaps it's also very interesting if you put this insight into the context of sociology and anthropology in India, especially rural sociology. So in fact, this kind of an insight that rural communities, despite all the odds, are fighting this land acquisition and disposition, etc. This kind of cautions against a stereotype of rural changelessness. That for a long time sociology and anthropology kind of assumed what is called the unchanging rural India. Now that's obviously, this insight shows that doesn't work anymore. But it also perhaps indicates that the current thesis that villages are being hollowed out because of a host of processes, particularly globalization and liberalization. Maybe that's also not that true. In some senses, the village is fighting back in some ways. How exactly needs to be probed, and that kind of a question, how exactly are villages being probed, is perhaps a question for empirical research. Exactly how And I'm trying to do something of that kind. So the backdrop for this kind of research is essentially a shift in the post-colonial developmentalist state. So, which is moving towards neoliberalism everywhere in the country and in Kerala as well. So, you find that this news, do you have a problem? Sure, you can leave if you want, you don't have to talk. Okay, so this new state mediates what is called the regimes of dispossession. Now you have what is called regimes of dispossession. And as we all know, it presides over jobless growth at the moment, we don't know that. And it exists, it actually threatens the very existence of rural communities. So that's a backdrop in which I'm trying to look at this particular site. So in Kerala, of course, there's a little difference in the way this happens. One is, of course, that post-colonial developmentalist welfarism has not died down. It has kind of mutated. I mean, it's definitely been recast in neoliberal terms. So the rhetoric right now is of self-help. The welfare is almost without exception directed towards individual families rather than community services and so on. So welfarism in Kerala has been neoliberalized, no doubt, but it survives. Unlike in many other parts of India, it has survived the right-wing onslaught for at least the past 5 years. This much we know. But then, it's not as if dispossession is absent. If you think about the Dubai Port Trust, so it's not just Pillai Vijay, by the way. It precedes Pillai Vijay. So it goes right back to the Dubai Port Trust, in fact the Vallarpadam controversy, where the state actually mediated the dispossession of land in the name of development and actually in the name of growth for private capital. And that has only grown, that tendency has only grown through the UDF government regime. It's become even more powerful in the present regime. So Vizhinjam, for example, was the Vizhinjam port, the International Container Terminal project, has been consistently supported by all parties, all political parties, equally. And the present government has been supporting the project, even despite the kind of loss that we have suffered during the very inclement weather last year, which actually affected Kerala's resource position. Even despite that, the project has been supported. So we are definitely living in a time when the post-colonial state is changing its color. But in Kerala, what is special is that despite the change of color, the focus on welfarism, the focus on distributing welfare, however neoliberalized, has not been given up. So that's the context. So the community I want to focus on is, as I told you, the fishing village called Adimalathura in the coastal area of Trivandrum. And what I want to really talk about is the unique role that women in this community have played in maintaining resilience in hard times. I mean, if you even a brief look at the history of the fisher community in the Trivandrum coast will tell you that incomes have been falling. Incomes from their main source of livelihood, which is fishing, have been steadily falling since the 1980s at least. So there's a lot of distress on the coast. And you actually find, and my argument is that if you are a visitor then, I mean, I was a visitor to this village in the 1980s when the fish worker mobilization, the independent fish worker mobilizations against the excessive capitalization of fish resources was happening in that area in the 1980s. I remember how this village used to look like. It is, I cannot describe to you how utterly miserable a place it was. If you visit it at the same place now, you will see that it has changed remarkably in very positive directions. I mean, it's a far more livable dignified place. Now, and this shift happened, remember, at a time when income from fishing fell, did not improve. Now, how did that happen, if you ask? Of course, it's a bigger question, but I'm going to offer you a little bit of that answer, only a little bit. There's much more to talk about, which I will not go into, but that little bit is about the role that women in that community have played in achieving that transformation into a much more livable place. And secondly, I'm trying to look at women's agency and resistance, in what is called the patriarchal bargain in this context. Now, like almost any other community in the country, this little community is also a patriarchal community. It is a community in which men definitely are dominant. Nevertheless, and there is a particular kind of bargain that women have struck with patriarchy there, which has determined the kind of agency that they have and the sort of resistance that they're capable of. Now, I want to give you a brief account of how that changed since the 1970s. So this idea of the patriarchal bargain, if any of you is interested, is from a Turkish researcher called Deniz Candioti. And she talks about it as basically it refers to the woman's decision to conform to the demands of patriarchy to gain some kind of benefit. So you agree to what the patriarch tells you to do, expecting that you will gain something from it. It's not some blind submission because you're afraid. It's not just fear that's prompting you to obey the patriarch, but the expectation that you will get something from it. And that's called a patriarchal bargain. So this is, as students of economics, I don't need to talk about it a lot, because obviously you know that agents always bargain, right? What do agents do? They have a preference. They have a set of preferences, and they will go for the best of those. Best bargain, and they will actively negotiate to bargain. So if you treat women as rational agents, then they will bargain. And how will they bargain? They will bargain within the options that they have. So the patriarchy definitely sets the frame of reference within which they can bargain. Now, what I'm going to show you is how changes in politics and policy can shift this bargain. The possibilities of the bargain change when women enter politics and policy. Politics, when I say politics, I'm not talking about party politics. I'm talking about politics as basically very fundamental arrangements of distributing power in society. So, obviously, if you look at the literature, of course, and for me this was an interesting topic, if only because the kind of role that women play in rural resilience is very under-researched. This is for the benefit of any of you who may want to be, who are already in research or may want to do some research. This is a very under-researched area. We all know that women do contribute hugely, and you know that there's a lot of literature on how women are vital to propping up communities that are threatened by poverty. So there's a vast literature on that now. And it's quite well documented, but then it ends up as essentially justifying the feminization of responsibility and obligation. So in some sense, there's a romanticization of that role that women perform, which ends up being, which ends up justifying their responsibility and obligation. Now, my idea is not really to do that. My idea is really to show you how it changes when women enter politics and policy as a welfarist policy, that is, as a policy interventions, that is. So there are three things I want to kind of show in this. One, that the patriarchal bargain may not always be passive subjection of women to the community goals, or it may also be not the case that they sustain family obligations fully within accepted terms of domestic dedication. In fact, these terms of their domestic dedication to actually change. Number 2, rural resilience in the face of multiple emerging threats is perhaps not reducible to exclusively materialist survivalism. So it's not, when you're talking about rural resilience, it's not enough to talk about material survival. Okay, this community is surviving materially, so then fine. A community is much more than its material survival. There are probably different kinds of social norms, etc., that define the community. So the community members may not recognize community survival in just material reproduction. Thirdly, it's very important that we do not romanticize or exaggerate the women's role in ensuring the resilience of the community. So now, the research that we did actually indicates that the state's shift towards neoliberal capitalism in Kerala, anywhere else, including Kerala, is a serious threat to rural communities, including the community I'm talking about, the one we did research in between 2015 and 2013 and 2017. And welfarism, if welfarism is not entirely hollow in these places, that's only because women in these places have used it imaginatively to their ends. So in some sense, these women have exercised agency in deciding how to use the welfare resources that flow into the community. So they add, that's one thing. The second thing is they have also translated the values and roles and relationships acceded to them within traditional arrangements into a voice of their own as part of the democratic upheavals in their community in the between the 1970s and 1990s. So this community faced a certain political mobilization between 1970 and 1990s because of the fish worker mobilization. Women were active participants in that. Now that allowed them to translate some of their traditional strengths into a proper voice later. So this is very important if you think, because it influences the ways in which the women use welfare resources and how they negotiate with the neoliberal governmental welfare system itself. So in some ways, so to put it very simply, the transformation of the patriarchal bargain in and through democratizing struggles in that community contributed very hugely to women's capacity to contribute to community resilience at a later date. So that's a thing. Now, so this is a chance then, naturally, to reflect on the agency that women of extremely disempowered communities may have through their participation in popular struggles on the one hand and governmental interventions on the other. So remember that this is a community that is extremely poor. It's a very, very underprivileged community. Remember, and this study becomes also relevant because when we talk about agency, we usually talk about a whole set of factors that might contribute to women's agency, like their education, their class location, their caste location, many other things, their social capital, many other things we kind of take into account. Remember, this is a community where none of this exists. The women of Adimalathurai do not have any of these advantages. Most of them do not have any of these advantages that we talk about when we talk about agency. So therefore, this study becomes important in that sense also. So let me tell you a little more about the site. This is one of the poorest communities in the fishing villages. Now, the Trivandrum coast is generally a poor area because you know that in Kerala, the fisher community is one of the most disadvantaged groups. Out of this, Adimalathurai is even more disadvantaged. So it's well known. It has a history of being prone to all kinds of ecological trouble. So the freak floods, for example. This phenomenon that's called Kalla Kadala. of the sea suddenly just entering the place and staying there for days together, for weeks together. So every house, everything goes underwater for days, for weeks on end. It's called Kala Kadal. And Adivilathuru is an area particularly prone to that kind of disaster. It has very severe drinking water shortage. And historically, it is an area which, it was a reclaimed area. It was a kind of an ecologically fuzzy interface between land and sea, because right behind there is a lake, and this is a kind of tiny little bit of land that sticks between the lake, a hill, and the sea. So it's a ecologically fuzzy kind of interface. It was a swamp. It was an uninhabited swamp. It was settled with assetless fishermen from Tamil Nadu by community capitalists in the neighboring Pulluvilla village. The neighboring Pulluvilla village has a history of migration to Sri Lanka in the 19th century, which brought capital, which brought some excess capital to the village. And those who had that capital invested it by extending fishing grounds in Adivilathuru. So Adivilathuru was a wild area. It was full of, it was a swamp. It was full of water. It was a marshy land, so not inhabitable. It was colonized by fishermen from Pulluvilla, and the fisher, you could call them community capitalists. They invested money in boats. They brought assetless labor from Tamil Nadu, from the fishing communities, allowed them to settle down in this marshy area. So you can see that the history of Adivilathuru is one of a proletarian settlement. It's a settlement of assetless fish workers, extremely poor people. So I did a micro history of this site, and the older people, the very old people, told me how it was shameful in their generation to marry any girl to Adivilathuru, because it was supposed nobody in the fishing villages would want their daughters to marry into Adivilathuru, because it was considered to be a very hard life there. So actually the village of Adivilathuru comprises of two wards, two coastal wards, in what is a predominantly mainland panchayat. So you can imagine the consequences of that. For the Kottagal panchayat, these are just two wards, and in the calculations, the development calculations of the panchayat, these two wards don't really figure that much, and their needs are very different from the needs of other areas. So it's roughly around 1,134 households. And as I told you, there's definitely much improvement since the 80s now. Houses, a large number of the houses are pakka houses with private latrines and electric connections, and some 12 kilometers of road surrounding the village. So our work was based on, and of course, fishing is largely non-mechanized craft. The boat owners in Adivilathuru own non-mechanized craft for most. So our sample was roughly 220 households from the 1,130 total, and it was a three-stage kind of research. It had a survey, and there was a survey to get a sense of the population. Then oral history to generate oral narrative-based history to capture the micro-history of that site. And then some extensive semi-structured interviews with women leaders. So out of the 47 Kudumbashree leaders, we interviewed 21. And of course, many more people were interviewed. Microhistory involves a very, very large number of interviewees. So if you look at this site, if you look at social life in this site, it doesn't conform to what Denise Candiotti calls classical patriarchy. She says that women bargain with different kinds of patriarchy. And South Asia particularly is known to house what is called classical patriarchy. It refers to a system which is like a North Indian system, which has now become national for India. It wasn't national earlier, but now it's national. So it's Southeast Asia. Now, South Asia. So you have women controlling resources, women essentially limited to domestic sphere, marriage a very important central event in the woman's life. The resource outflows largely happening from the woman's house to the man's house. So dowry payments, mostly in marriages. And of course, the woman's dependence on the man, economic dependence of the woman, celebrated as a cultural virtue. So not working in any other part, in South Africa or Southeast Asia, a woman who doesn't work is a disgrace. While in India, in South Asia, a woman working is a disgrace. So, but this is not existed in Adivilathura. This is the interesting thing. In Adivilathura, you don't find this classic patriarchy. Traditionally. What you find traditionally in the community, the women have always worked in Adivilathura. I mean, when we collected work histories of the site, there is a clear fall in the number of work options available. Like, for example, some 3-4 decades before, women were auctioneers, fish auctioneers. The women conducted the fish auctions and they earned an income from being auctioneers. That's gone. Women used to make nets, repair nets. That's gone too. Now, the older generation largely engages in fish vending. Women are fish vendors. They travel to the town to sell fish. They travel to quite far off places actually to sell fish. It's an entirely woman-run operation, fish vending. Now, again, women initiate other women into the fish trade. So when you marry, if your mother-in-law is a fish vendor, after you have 2 or 3 children and they're a little grown up, your mother-in-law initiates you into fish vending. So you go with your mother-in-law first. So she or your aunt, some female kin, some senior female kin initiates you into work. Again, not common at all for classic patriarchy in the Indian context. Women manage money in homes. So the other thing is, women are money managers. So any large sum of money that comes into the house, it's the woman who decides how to manage it, how to use it. Again, not at all the norm for classic patriarchy. Then there is this thing called uxury locality. That is to say that in marriage, the man stays at the woman's house after marriage. So your husband stays in the wife's house after marriage. So dowry is peculiar. Dowry is very high. In fact, very, very high. Shockingly high. In fact, dowry debt in Adivilathura is huge. The average debt per family is 4 lakhs. For a poverty-stricken community, remember. And the average debt in a house with daughters is 8 lakhs. Huge. But what is interesting is that this dowry is not taken by the husband's family completely. There is something that's called Valattu Kuli, which is given to the parents of the man. So, say if you pay 8 lakhs dowry for your wedding, then your husband's parents get 2 lakh rupees and that's it. The rest of the money comes right back to you to set up a new house. And it's the woman who decides how to use it. Very often, the girl, if there are not too many children, the man stays with his wife's parents. And it's an accepted thing. So the point is, girls therefore fight for dowry in that place. Girls insist they will not leave without a dowry. Because they get to use that dowry. It's not as if it's, it goes to someone else. So this is their uxury locality. And women are known to be outspoken. They are known. That's why we are all the respectable women in this room must have heard the reprimand at home when you raise your voice. So, മീൻകാരി അലയ്ക്കും. കാരണം വെച്ചാൽ അതിനുള്ള സാഹചര്യം അവരുടെ സമുദായത്തിലുണ്ട്. അതൊരു മോശമായ കാര്യമല്ല വെച്ചിരിക്കും. ഒക്കത്തന്നെ സംസാരിക്കണം. പറയേണ്ട കാര്യം പറയുന്നേ വേണം എന്നുള്ളത്. So they are outspoken. And of course, they have been active participants in all kinds of struggles. In fact, the most vivid images in the Vimojana Sangha, when the fisher community was actually mobilized by the church, is the participation of fishermen. In fact, the most militant of those public demonstrations were conducted by the women, the fisher women, because they were told that the community is under threat, they are all going to be removed from the coast and so on. And so they fought to defend their own. There are rumors of how Mahadevan appeared in front of a police, a posse police, armed police, in the garb of a fisherwoman, saying, "Shoot me." And the woman, like extraordinarily tall, strong woman. So it's not the usual girl-like Mother Mary, who in their imagination is a tall, strong fisherwoman, broad-shouldered fisherwoman, standing in front of a posse of soldiers and challenging them to shoot her. So that's a myth associated with the Vimodaswara, of how Mother Mary appeared there. Anyway, so, but then at the same time there are restrictions. This is still a patriarchy, and the primary norm is that women are not allowed to go fishing. It's only very recently that a woman actually broke that. In fact, a couple of months back, or a month back or so, the first time a woman actually got a boat and went to the sea fishing. Now that has been there for a long time. Then, not all women are equally empowered in this frame. It's the older women who are empowered. The younger women are expected to stay at home to take care of the younger ones and all. So the oldest child, if she happens to be a female, is terribly disadvantaged because she ends up taking care of all the younger ones. And the other thing is, of course, what happens in this system, because you cannot really, you cannot go into the sea, and the sea is your major source of income. Any family that does not have a male child is terribly disadvantaged in terms of income. And of course, there is very heavy community surveillance. So the women are watched all the time. There's no freedom otherwise. And of course, our interviewees mentioned very, very high frequency of domestic violence. Very high frequency, especially with falling incomes. Falling male incomes means much higher domestic fights at home, and women are outspoken, so they do ask. So there's a lot of quarreling around men spending their money on liquor or on their own, whatever pursuits, and women being outspoken, they do talk. So it ends up in physical violence. And finally, of course, none of this is meant to explicitly acknowledge women's social agency and economic agency. So women, all you can say is that women were very important to the community, traditionally very important to the community. And if by agency we mean the ability to make choices and gain voice within the community, this is how I would define agency, then this is not that. There's no acknowledgement that women should talk or women can have a voice. It's just that they do talk. So that's the thing. So interviewees, often told us how their mothers fought to get them an education. So if it were a community that women were allowed agency, then there should have been no contest. When a mother says that, okay, my children are going to go to school and get an education, nobody should need to contest them. But that was not the case. The women just broke through, by asserting themselves, but that was not considered to be something they could do in social terms. Now, but what is interesting is, now this traditional advantage that they had in the community, in that it was not characterized by classic patriarchy, became very important when it came to the politicization in the 70s and 80s through what is called it first started as, the community development project at the Mahadevan village, which was aimed at protecting fish workers from the exploitation of merchants and others. And after that came what is called the Project for Community Organization, which was a voluntary association set up in 1977 to mobilize fish workers into struggles for their demands and produce the kind of research they needed for these struggles. In the 1980s, when some of us were college students, these struggles were exciting moments, I mean, in the 1980s, there were massive struggles against overfishing of the seas, of mechanical boats just destroying the fish wealth, the ecological basis of the fish wealth in the seas. And the All India Independent Fish Workers Federation was formed in the 1980s. They conducted several struggles. Adimalathura was also an important center of the struggle. So the women, they actually remember the early mobilizations very vividly. So the women's meetings, which had a Bible study and then a discussion of a secular issue of national or regional importance, and finally some kind of a discussion on the daily life of the village itself. So women's organizational meetings had these three parts. So first was an independent Bible study. So whatever was taught in the church, that was set aside, and then they tried to read the Bible on their own, to make sense of the Bible on their own. Then there was this discussion of some secular thing going on outside in India or somewhere else, or in Kerala. Something outside the village, something not connected to a very local area. And thirdly, a discussion on local life. So in some sense, it was kind of connecting, trying to develop the ability to connect very critically to these different. And I forgot to tell you that, of course, the Catholic Church is a massive presence. So you almost have a double governmental situation where the governance of the Catholic Church is as important as the state governance in this area. So doing Bible study on their own is a revolutionary act, because it's like saying that, okay, the church may have its interpretation, but here we are doing our own interpretation. So in fact, there's a whole generation of older women in Adimalathura who went through this process, who were put through this process. And they are still very active. So what these women recount is the shift from being just important members of the community to actually becoming a collective voice in the community. And instead of saying, being important in their homes or among their relatives, suddenly they became the representatives of women's voice in the community. That was a massive shift, according to them. So one of them, in fact, put it this way. She said, we moved into citizenship. She used the word paulatho. And she said, she explained this by pointing to the difference in the way they travel now. Her name is Greta. Greta was a fish vendor, and she says that they would travel every day to remote parts of Trivandrum city to sell their fish. So it's not as if they have not seen the world outside. But inevitably, those trips they were accompanied by senior relatives, as I told you, mostly older women, their older aunts or mothers, so who insisted, so community surveillance was intact in all these travels. And you essentially went there to sell your stuff and come back. But traveling with the PCO, the Project for Community Organization, was a very different experience. Because here you then travel to learn. So the aim of traveling was very different. It was to learn. And it was also free from family surveillance. So your family members didn't go with you. So you were much more free to look and hear and learn. And many of these women then actively became part of what is called the Coastal Women's Front, which was formed in the 1980s. And they were very active, and in fact, that was a time when a number of issues of rape, of murder, all kinds of things were actively taken up by the Coastal Women's Association, Coastal Women's Front, and they were politicized. So in Adimalathura, you can see that this kind of shifts the patriarchal bargain, because in fact, it came late to in the 1990s. Adimalathura was completely, until the 1990s, Adimalathura was totally controlled by a certain community capitalist based in Pillai. So he owned the land, he owned the boats, and he was like a gunda. That is, anybody defying him would definitely be beaten. So all the fishermen were in debt. So this was bonded labor of a kind. He made sure that advances would keep the fishermen completely under his thumb. All developmental initiatives were run by him. He was a Congress man's member. So there was the panchayat was already there. He was a member. So his wife ran the feeding center. The Anganwadi and the feeding center were completely controlled by this man's wife. In the 1990s, in this upsurge of the political struggle in the independent fish workers movement, this community capitalist was thrown out. He was forced to give the title deeds of all the properties that fish workers were occupying to build their huts. So all the hutments had to be transferred. Deeds of the hutments were transferred to the fishermen in Adimalthura, and his importance, he was actually thrown out. He was dethroned in some ways. And one of the reasons why this happened was also because the church began to democratize at the end of the 1980s. So the church authority at that point decided to decentralize. So now you have what is called what is called the BCC, the Basic Christian Community. Have you heard of those? I'm sure the Catholics here, they'll know. The Basic Christian Communities, which is like a Kudumbashree group. A group of 20 families, in one, and they meet at the house of one of these members of the group every week to have a common prayer and so on. And this is organized like the Kudumbashree in three, this is preceding the Kudumbashree, remember, in three levels. So you have the parish, and you have the Farane level, and at the Farona level, and the diocese. So it's a three-tiered structure. 1/3 of the membership was given to women. So this is an interesting thing, because in these communities, the so-called better off people, who were not fisher folk, who did not belong to the Latin Catholic community, they fell under the classic patriarchy of the Catholic Church. So most of them would not volunteer to become members. So all those positions almost inevitably went to the women of the fisher community. So you can imagine, in the parish committee, you may have college lecturers and teachers sitting next to a fish vendor woman. And the fish vendor woman has to be accorded the same degree of respect as a parish committee member as the college lecturer. So this was important. So the women were quick to notice this, and they volunteered to sit on the parish committees quickly. Now that was very important in their entry into church governance. Some of them, but at the end of the struggles, economically they were exhausted. They had to pay a huge price at throwing off this Madhurali. So a lot of them ended up in debt. So to get out of that, a lot of them migrated. So the women there tell us that it's only because of this movement, of the kind of exposure to the world outside that they got through the fish workers movement, that they actually managed to get the courage to migrate. A lot of them went to Gulf as domestic workers, worked there for 10 years, 15 years, and came back making this money. So in that sense, your options, the livelihood options expanded with this exposure. And this BCC meant that socially again they began to make this shift towards. Now, both the BCC, what is interesting is that both the BCC as well as what is called the Trivandrum Social Service Society, which is a kind of an NGO which basically encourages microcredit and micro-entrepreneurship among the fisher community. They tried to bring what is called classical patriarchy, in the sense that men were advised to be truly leaders of the family, they should not drink and so on, they should actually become the masters of the home. Families were advised to marry their daughters off to far distant places, so that the familiarity that made them bold enough to retort, തിരിച്ച് മറിച്ച് പറയാനായിട്ട് പരിചയമുള്ളവരാകുമ്പോൾ എന്തെങ്കിലുമൊക്കെ പറയുമല്ലോ, തിരിച്ചു പറയും. ദൂരെ എവിടെയെങ്കിലും കെട്ടിച്ചുവിട്ടാൽ ഈ പ്രശ്നം ഉണ്ടാവില്ലെന്ന് അങ്ങനെ ഉപദേശം വരാൻ തുടങ്ങി. Women were discouraged from sending children to boarding schools. They were doing that because the boarding schools, there was this arrangement. Many convents required children in boarding schools, and so a lot of these kids, so the women were free. Once a child turned 10, they would, even before, they would send the kid to a convent school. So they would be free to do other kinds of work. That was discouraged by the church. Now, but then the thing is that the church authority is actually rejected, and in fact, if you do field work there, it's like a Shyam Pushkaran movie. It's like a Shyam Pushkaran. All these new movies, that the Dilish Potan kind of movies. So the nuns are trying very hard to bring classical patriarchy there, and nobody else is taking them seriously. So when the nuns said, lots of women do wrong things. They have affairs. Some of them have 2 husbands, and they do all kinds of funny things. But the thing about this community is that, of course, they are abused. Nobody likes all that. So women will openly say, but they will do lady, and all that on the road they will abuse. Openly abuse and call them, but they will not exclude. So these women are never excluded. These women may do wrong things, morally wrong things, but they are not thrown out of the community. They are abused, they are scolded, sometimes beaten on the road, but the community will not throw them out. There will be still, there will be still engagement with the community. So the church is trying very hard to throw those women out, the community will not throw them out. So this is one thing. So you can see that. And now on top of this comes Kudumbashree and many other governmental flows. There are several things. The Municipal is giving a lot of help. Kudumbashree, then all these new projects like Tira Maitri, etc., which are coming through the Panchayat. Now, so you're seeing that now once government intervention has become strong and women are taking that seriously, you see 2 things. One, that the patriarchal bargain has definitely shifted. Secondly, shifted further from what I told you. I told you that they had gained a voice. It's now become even more, shifted even further. And the church's effort to reinstate this classical patriarchy is actually, failing. Was failing, at least when we left that place. So this field survey showed a very clear correlation between women's participation in a variety of forums, that is, political forums, social forums, developmental forums, community forums, different forums, and their ability to expand livelihood options. So there's a clear correlation you can see. So what they do is they combine these resources for 3 things. One is self-employment. The second is to rejuvenate their internal credit networks. And thirdly, to improve their position in the parish, contributing to this annual pilgrimage there. So in self-employment, it's very interesting because the CDS chairperson in Kottagal is inevitably from Adimalathura, because these are the women who are used to working. So they are the ones who've taken the lead in Kudumbashree. And the board member, of course, has great ideas of this panchayat becoming a hub of production and all that. The women reject it. The women do not want to do that. Women are clear on that, and they say that they basically want, they're juggling too many things. So their whole idea of development and well-being is completely different from what the panchayat. For them, development is essentially, finding the resources for family survival and some upward mobility, like sending children to school, educating their children, etc. But they don't want to make a profit. So they don't want. So what they do is they pick the options that look like good for them. For example, fish pickling. And fish pickling, interestingly, is sold at a 500% markup. So you can imagine. The husbands bring back the fish. They get it cheap. They get the mildly damaged fish for nothing, almost nothing, like 5 rupees a kilo and so on. And then they pickle it, and a kilo is sold for like 500 rupees. So it's a huge, so that happens in certain seasons. They make a lot of money in that season. They have a market on the beach. Now this market is sets up early, like that market starts at 6 o'clock, and it serves cooked breakfast and stuff like that. So a lot of people just buy it from the market. And they're smart because they know that the market in the mainland will open only at 10. So early bird gets the work, and they can. What commodities should slippers, chappals, because they think that chappals break easily in the coast. But they will not have any fancy saris, etc. They have nighties. And the nighties that they produce in their groups elsewhere India, because nighties are what women wear for most of the time, and they quickly bleach with the sun. So there's a lot of calculation that actually goes into what commodities are allowed to be sold in the market. They're making a profit out of that. But they don't want to go any further. Now what is interesting is, this money is the NREGS money. The money that comes into the market is the MNREGS money. And so you have the MNREGS resources circulating within the coastal community, because all the people who come to sell commodities in the market are locals, are local fish workers, basically fish worker family. So that money that the state sends into this area through the MNREGS circulates right there. So in some ways, the market that the women have created is embedded in that society. So it's a very different market, and there is no way that the local panchayat member can really approve of this, because the panchayat member's idea of the market is very different idea of the market. The women do not want to be slaves to that market. They want to keep it embedded in their local society. Now, the second thing is, of course, regenerating internal credit networks. That's very important, because I told you, all these people who receive dowry like in this way, that Valavuthu, they usually don't take it to the bank. They circulate it internally. So there is an active credit, circulation of credit. So most of the excess money that any family manages to accumulate there circulates within. So Kudumbashree resources are also circulating like that. So the loans that women get will circulate in the community itself. It may be even re-lent and so on. And thirdly, of course, women use this position to improve their standing with the parish. And it's interesting, one of the women told me that the parish priest is highly dependent on the women for information about the community. All said and done, the parish priest is an outsider. So in order to know anything about the community, they have to rely on the women. And only women are reliable, because men are either drunk or generally, they are not there. So obviously the women have an advantage there. They're making a very good use of it. So, and they're not pursuing what you would call gendered life scripts, of classical patriarchy. For example, there are women who say, superficially it looks like classical patriarchy, but it's not. Like this is one leader who said, no, women are very noisy these days. They have money and they manage the house, and they keep the men under control, and then they get very angry when the men do bad things. But now we tell them that they should be calm. They should be quiet and calm. Why? Because there's no point shouting at people who are drunk, who can't think. So you have to wait till they become sober, so don't shout. So that move towards being a calm woman is not dictated by fear of any patriarch. It's rather by the need to control and manage. So it's a very different life script, that is. And more importantly, these MNREGS spaces are solidarity spaces for these women. So one really funny Shyam Pushkaran story was about how one day apparently, I interviewed all the nuns in the local convent. So one of the nuns, who's a family counselor for the community, she said that it's very difficult because one day many men went to her and complained saying that these women are terrible. They go to these NREGS work sites and then they make fun of us. They talk about sex. They talk about our performance in bed, and they all joke and they all laugh. So this is becoming terrible. And for the nun, of course, this is terrible because this is breach of sacred family privacy and all that. So she went to the work site, met the maid, and told her you should. So the maid said she promised. So she said, I'll tell the women as much. I tell the women that they shouldn't bring in stories here, but then they all still do. So the maid was helpless. So in the BCC, the next BCC, this nun asked those women, okay, I hear some really bad things about you, and I heard that there are women in our community who talk about their husbands in bed. in women's groups, the NRGS groups, and then they say that those men are not good enough, and then they all laugh. Is this true? And then all the women say, yes, it's all true for the next, not our group. There's another group. I know the other group. The other group, they're all talking. I know. And then all the full details were shared with the nuns as well. And the man was aghast. She said, the only way to find out this group is to ask the next group. So that's how it is. So in some ways, the women managed to evade the surveillance of the church. And the MNRG site is an important place where all this happens. This kind of solidarity and stuff happens. Now, in both ways you can actually see that this is changing. However, and this is where I want to end, and I'm ending on a bad note, because the coming of the port now changes the entire scene. Because now what you have is full-fledged dispossession. And because dispossession is not development, please, I think all of you need to know the difference. If you want to know what the difference is between development and growth, development is a discourse in which even marginalized groups can have a voice. In growth, no. So what is happening in Vizhinjam now is growth. So in the run-up to the port, all participants were men. All political parties who supported the port, who created a discourse of Vizhinjam being the Trivandrum's salvation, all of those were men. The TV channels and the press that covered the event did not bother to ask the women, though even their livelihoods were at stake. So the women were a conspicuous absence, if you notice, in the entire discussion, which means that women have not been included in the politics of resistance as far as the port is concerned. They have not been considered in any of the packages, the compensation packages and so on. So you can actually see, so what happens then is that far from carving out some kind of agency and voice within the discourse of growth, women are completely rendered completely invisible and voiceless. So that is really, and I want to stop there because that is really, and as students of economics, perhaps it's important for you to take into account seriously this whole question. So is growth fabulous? Yeah, growth. I'm sure all of us are great devotees of growth. But what does it promise the poor? And what does it promise those groups who are actually seriously disadvantaged among the poor is a question that we cannot shut our eyes to. That's where I end. Thank you.
It's 5 o'clock, so I won't take much time. So it is indeed a privilege that to organize a seminar in the department in a continuous manner. So last week we had, and previous week we had, so it is actually an ongoing process, seminar after seminar, international to national, and all kinds of topic from fisher folks. Actually, in January we had a seminar on fisher folks. Yeah, 3-day international seminar. So many people were being turned, and there were a huge discussion on all that. About, especially the concluding session is also about the life of fisher women, indeed, which was missed in the last seminar. The 2 speakers supposed to come, they couldn't actually turn up actually, so that is why it became a dry area in that line. So then we had also Kerala rebuilding seminar, then we have water resource seminar, and now we are having today the women and development, economic development seminar. Of course, this is a 1-day seminar, as I started saying today in the morning, that this venture we are actually planning to have every year. So we are going to have actually a seminar on women and economic development every year from this year onward. Last year we are actually planned, but it was not materialized. So from this year onwards, this is going to be every year we are going to have a seminar on women and economic development. So this is a serious, and maybe you can call it the first seminar in that line. And I'm very glad that all the 5 speakers in fact shared very important points on different aspects, and you could actually recollect that the first speaker was talked about the economic and the budgeting, the economic aspect of women and economic development, and then we had social aspect, then we have historical aspect, then we have international relation aspect and political science perspective, and finally we have actually the micro level looking at of the problem. So in that sense, I hope my student of economics who had at least gained various aspects of women and development from different angle and how we can basically look into the problem.
Respected dignitaries on and off the dais and my dear friends, it's my privilege has been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. First of all, I would like to express my sincere thanks to Abdul Salim sir, head of the department, for being such a source of inspiration and also the guidance for all our programs that has been conducted by this department. And also, I express my gratitude to Siddik sir, organizing secretary, for initiating such a seminar on the meaningful topic. Thank you, sir.